On May 7, 1915, a single torpedo from German submarine U-20 struck the RMS Lusitania off the Irish coast, triggering a catastrophic secondary explosion that sent the luxury liner to the bottom in just 18 minutes, killing 1,198 men, women, and children, including 128 Americans. This single act of war did more to shift American public opinion toward intervention than any battle on the Western Front. It established the template of grievances President Wilson would cite 2 years later when asking Congress to declare war on Germany. The sinking remains one of history's most controversial maritime disasters, surrounded by legitimate questions about British negligence, German culpability, and explosive cargo that governments concealed for decades. What follows is what we know, and what we still don't, about 18 minutes that changed the course of human history. By spring 1915, the Great War had devolved into a nightmare no strategist had anticipated. The Western Front had solidified into 440 miles of continuous trenches stretching from the Belgian coast to Switzerland. A defensive labyrinth of machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery that made frontal assault catastrophically costly. The front had shifted no more than 50 miles from its position at First Ypres and would remain essentially static until 1918. The Second Battle of Ypres, raging as Lusitania sailed, introduced a new horror to warfare. On April 22, Germany released 168 tons of chlorine gas from nearly 6,000 cylinders, opening a 4-mile gap in French lines and killing over 10,000 men, half on the first day alone. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front offered Germany its only success. The Gorlitz-Tarnow offensive, launched May 1st, would destroy the Russian Third Army within 8 days, eventually pushing the front 500 kilometers eastward and capturing nearly 1 million Russian prisoners. But Germany's surface fleet remained bottled up in port, neutralized by British naval supremacy. Britain's distant blockade, controlling exits to the Atlantic from the English Channel to Norway, was slowly strangling the German economy. Germany imported 20% of its food by calorific value, 42% of fats, and 97% of vegetable oils before the war. By June 1915, bread rationing began. Between 478,000 and 800,000 German civilians would ultimately die from hunger-related diseases. German military leaders saw the submarine as their only weapon capable of striking back. Admiral Hugo von Pohl argued that since the land war had reached stalemate, naval warfare must target Britain's maritime lifeline. On February 4, 1915, Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone, where enemy merchant vessels would be destroyed, quote, without its always being possible to warn the crews or passengers. The policy was a desperate gamble. Germany possessed only 21 to 28 operational submarines against Britain's 20 million tons of merchant shipping. Across the Atlantic, President Woodrow Wilson had declared American neutrality on August 4, 1914, appealing to Americans to be, quote, impartial in thought as well as in action. But neutrality was becoming economically impossible. U.S. exports to Allied nations had quadrupled from approximately $750 million to $3 billion between 1914 and 1916. Exports to Germany collapsed from $169 million to just $1.2 million as the British blockade tightened. By September 1915, Wilson had reluctantly approved a $500 million loan to France and Britain. The war was making America rich and increasingly entangled with Allied fortunes. The submarine that would sink Lusitania was SMU-20, a Type U-19 class boat, the first German submarines with diesel engines for surface propulsion. She measured 210 feet long, displaced 650 tons surfaced, and could make 15 knots on the surface but only 9.5 knots submerged, slower than any ocean liner. Her armament included 4 torpedo tubes carrying just 6 torpedoes, plus a single deck gun. Her crew of 35 men operated in cramped, dangerous conditions, with submerged range limited to only 80 nautical miles at 5 knots. Her commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Walter Schwieger, was 30 years old, a career naval officer from a noble Berlin family who personally disliked the aristocratic von prefix. He had joined the Imperial German Navy in 1903 and transferred to submarine service in 1911. By May 1915, he commanded one of Germany's most effective U-boats, known for a shoot-first-and-ask-questions-later approach that frequently attacked ships without warning. He would ultimately sink 49 ships totaling over 183,000 tons, becoming the sixth most successful submarine commander of the war. U-20 departed Emden on April 30, 1915, with orders to patrol shipping around Liverpool via the Irish Sea. Here's where the story takes its first dark turn. British codebreakers in Room 40, the Admiralty's secret intelligence unit, knew the moment she left. They tracked her wireless transmissions. Schwieger's radio operator repeated the boat's position 14 times in 24 hours on the first day alone. Room 40 knew her route would take her north around Scotland and Ireland, down the western and southern coasts, and into the Irish Sea. The British knew exactly where U-20 was heading. Before encountering Lusitania, U-20 had already sunk 3 ships. On May 5th, Schwieger surfaced to shell the schooner Earl of Latham, allowing her crew to evacuate. On May 6th, he torpedoed the SS Candidate and the SS Centurion. And here's a detail that will haunt you. Survivors of the Candidate specifically requested that news of their torpedoing be relayed to Lusitania for safety. That message was never passed on. By the morning of May 7th, U-20 was low on fuel with only 3 torpedoes remaining. Schwieger had begun the return journey to Germany when at 2 p.m. he spotted a magnificent sight through his periscope. Quote, "Straight ahead, the 4 funnels and 2 masts of a steamer were visible. RMS Lusitania was no ordinary ship. At 787 feet long and 31,550 gross tons, she was a floating palace that embodied Edwardian confidence in technology and progress. Built by John Brown and Company at Clydebank, Scotland, and launched in 1906, she was the first British four-stacker, the first ship over 30,000 tons, and the first ocean liner with passenger elevators. Her 4 Parsons steam turbines generated up to 76,000 shaft horsepower, driving her to speeds exceeding 25 knots, fast enough to outrun any submarine. She had won the Blue Riband in 1907 for the fastest Atlantic crossing, ending a decade of German dominance and becoming a symbol of British maritime supremacy. Her first-class accommodations featured Georgian, Queen Anne, and Louis XVI furnishings. Her dining rooms, smoking rooms, and lounges rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. But Lusitania had always been more than a passenger liner. The British Admiralty had provided a £2.6 million low-interest loan for her construction plus annual operating subsidies. In return, she was built to naval specifications with reinforced mounting points for 12 6-inch guns. She was listed in Jane's All the World's Fighting Ships as a potential auxiliary cruiser and flew the Blue Ensign as a Royal Naval Reserve merchant vessel. When she departed New York's Pier 54 at 12:20 p.m. on May 1, 1915, she carried 1,959 passengers and crew, including 290 first-class passengers, 600 second-class, and 372 third-class, plus approximately 700 crew. Among them were 159 Americans and 129 children, including 35 infants. Her passenger list read like a society register. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, 37 years old, one of America's wealthiest men, traveled in Parlor Suite B65. Charles Frohman, America's leading theatrical producer who had brought Peter Pan to Broadway, was returning to London. Elbert Hubbard, the famous writer and founder of the Roycroft artisan community, sailed with his wife Alice. Sir Hugh Lane, the Irish art collector, reportedly carried Rembrandt and Monet paintings in sealed lead tubes. That same morning, the German embassy had published a warning in New York newspapers, placed directly adjacent to Cunard's sailing advertisement. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and Great Britain. Vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction in those waters, and travelers sailing in the war zone do so at their own risk. Most passengers dismissed it as German bluster. Cunard officials assured them Lusitania was too fast to catch. Now here's where the conspiracy theories begin, and where documented facts get genuinely disturbing. The official manifest listed general cargo, furs, copper, cheese, and similar goods. But a supplementary manifest, filed after the ship left American waters, told a different story. Lusitania carried 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges, approximately 4.2 million rounds, weighing 173 tons. She carried 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells listed as empty. She carried 18 cases of percussion fuses declared non-explosive, and she carried 46 tons of aluminum powder, highly volatile, used in munitions manufacture. The U.S. Customs Collector declared in June 1915 that, quote, the Lusitania on her last voyage carried no explosives of any kind. This was technically true by American statutory definition. Rifle cartridges are not classified as explosives, but it was profoundly misleading. Declassified documents and dive expeditions have revealed the full extent of the deception. A Bethlehem Steel shipping note from April 28, 1915, shows the shrapnel shells were listed as 3-inch caliber shrapnel shells, filled, not empty. The Royal Artillery Regiment's Historical Trust confirmed each shell contained 1.25 pounds of cordite propellant. They were live ammunition. In 1982, the British Foreign Office acknowledged for the first time that, quote, there is a large amount of ammunition in the wreck, some of which is highly dangerous. A 2008 dive expedition discovered 15,000 rounds of .303 ammunition in the bow section, in an area not listed on any manifest. When divers recovered 7 gleaming Remington cartridges, they provided physical proof of cargo that for decades British and American officials said didn't exist. The manifest also listed 90 tons of unrefrigerated butter and cheese destined for the Royal Navy weapons testing establishment in Essex. Both items were insured at special government rates, insurance that was never claimed after sinking. Why rancid dairy products would go to a weapons facility remains unexplained. Captain William Thomas Turner was 59 years old, a veteran seaman who had first gone to sea as a cabin boy at age 8. Known as Bowler Bill for his favorite off-duty headgear, he had been awarded medals for bravery in multiple rescues at sea and commanded Cunard's finest liners. He avoided passengers whenever possible, describing them as, quote, a load of bloody monkeys who are constantly chattering. A gruffness that paradoxically made him popular with travelers who specifically requested his ships. Turner had taken command of Lusitania in April 1915, replacing Captain Daniel Dow, who had suffered nervous exhaustion from the stress of submarine threats. On the final voyage, Turner received multiple Admiralty warnings. May 6, 12:50 a.m. Avoid headlands, pass harbors at full speed, steer mid-channel course, submarines off Fastnet. May 6, 7:50 a.m. Submarines active off south coast of Ireland. May 7, 11:25 a.m. Submarines active in southern part of Irish Channel. Last heard of south of Coningbeg Lighthouse. Make certain Lusitania gets this. Turner received these warnings, but he made decisions that, in hindsight, proved catastrophic. Lusitania's maximum speed had been reduced from 25 knots to 21 knots after Cunard shut down 6 of her 25 boilers in November 1914 to conserve coal and crew costs. On May 7th, Turner further reduced speed to approximately 18 knots due to morning fog and to time his arrival with the Liverpool tide. More critically, Turner was sailing 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, closer to the Irish coast than Admiralty instructions advised, and on a straight course, not zigzagging. The Admiralty had instructed that, quote, fast steamers can considerably reduce the chance of successful surprise submarine attacks by zigzagging. Turner later testified he had zigzagged around noon but stopped, interpreting the instructions as requiring evasive maneuvers only when a submarine was actually sighted. These decisions placed Lusitania on a predictable course at reduced speed, directly in U-20's patrol area. At 2:10 p.m. on May 7, 1915, Schwieger fired a single torpedo from 700 meters. It struck the starboard side, just below the wheelhouse near the first funnel. Schwieger recorded in his war diary, "Shot struck starboard side close behind the bridge. An extraordinarily heavy detonation followed, with a very large cloud of smoke far above the front funnel. A second explosion must have followed that of the torpedo, boiler or coal or powder. That second explosion remains the enduring mystery of the Lusitania. Nearly all survivors reported hearing 2 distinct explosions seconds apart. Witnesses described a geyser of steel plating, coal, cinders, and debris rising high above the deck. The second blast was far more powerful than the torpedo impact, and it sealed the ship's fate. Lusitania began listing immediately to starboard. Electrical power failed almost instantly. The bow plunged downward as flooding cascaded through the ship. Captain Turner ordered a hard turn toward the Irish coast, hoping to beach the vessel, but power to the helm had already failed. The ship was still moving at 18 knots, acting, as one investigator put it, like a giant scoop, forcing water into the hull. The severe starboard list made launching lifeboats nearly impossible. Starboard boats swung too far out to board. Port boats swung inward, unable to clear the ship's side. Of the 48 lifeboats aboard, more than enough for everyone, only 6 were successfully launched. Several boats tipped on release, spilling passengers into the sea. Others crashed onto the deck below, killing dozens. Schwieger watched through his periscope with grim fascination. Many people must have lost their heads. Several boats loaded with people rushed downward, struck the water bow or stern first, and filled at once. The ship blew off steam. At the bow, the name Lusitania in golden letters was visible. At 2:28 p.m., just 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, Lusitania made her final plunge. Her funnels and masts disappeared last beneath the calm sea. Schwieger noted that he chose not to fire a second torpedo. Nor could I have fired another torpedo into this swarm of people who were trying to save themselves. Titanic took over 2 hours to sink after striking an iceberg. Lusitania disappeared in 18 minutes. Why? Several factors explain the catastrophic speed. First, a critical design flaw. Unlike Titanic, which had only transverse bulkheads, Lusitania had both transverse and longitudinal bulkheads. When flooded on one side, water was confined to that side, causing a severe list rather than even flooding. A British inquiry after Titanic had already warned that flooding coal bunkers outside longitudinal bulkheads could increase the ship's list and make lowering boats on the other side impracticable. Flooding of only 3 coal bunkers could result in negative metacentric height, meaning the ship could capsize. Second, structural vulnerability. The torpedo struck where longitudinal bulkheads couldn't curve with the narrowing bow. They stepped in instead. Multiple compartments were ruptured simultaneously at this junction point. Third, forward momentum. With steam lines damaged, Turner could not stop the ship. At 18 knots, the vessel continued plowing forward, forcing water into the breach. Fourth, open portholes. Many portholes were open, contrary to orders, accelerating flooding as the ship listed. And finally, cascade failure. As the list increased, water flowed over the tops of bulkheads designed to contain flooding. Electrical failure trapped crew in lower decks. Watertight doors could not be reopened. Within 6 minutes, the forecastle began to submerge. The cause of the secondary explosion has generated a century of debate. 4 major theories have emerged, each with supporting evidence and significant problems. The munitions theory holds that the torpedo detonated the ship's cargo of ammunition. The manifest did list 173 tons of rifle cartridges and live shrapnel shells, and more ammunition has been found in undocumented locations. However, a 1993 expedition found the cargo magazine clearly undamaged, with 173 tons of munitions unexploded and undisturbed. Rifle cartridges do not explode even when set on fire, and shrapnel shell burster charges are too small to cause a massive secondary blast. The coal dust theory suggests that near-empty coal bunkers at the end of the transatlantic voyage would have contained suspended coal dust, which is explosive at certain concentrations. However, laboratory testing concluded that damp coal dust doesn't explode very well, and coal in ship bunkers was typically dampened by condensation from contact with cold seawater. The boiler explosion theory gained support from 2012 testing, which concluded it was the most likely cause. Steam pressure collapsed from 195 pounds per square inch before the explosion to 50 pounds per square inch afterward. However, and this is crucial, all functioning boiler rooms had survivors, and none reported explosions originating there at the time of sinking. The aluminum powder theory notes that Lusitania carried 46 tons of highly volatile aluminum powder. When suspended in air at proper concentrations, aluminum powder is extraordinarily explosive. Some witnesses reported seeing fine white powder above the bow after the second explosion. A 2021 dive expedition photographed Lusitania's boilers for the first time and found them completely intact, contradicting both the coal dust and boiler explosion theories. The debate continues. No aspect of the Lusitania disaster generates more controversy than the British Admiralty's conduct. The failures were numerous and documented. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, had written to Walter Runciman, President of the Board of Trade, on February 12, 1915, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the U.S. with Germany. If some of it gets into trouble, better still." This letter, discovered in 1968, has fueled conspiracy theories ever since. Churchill's defenders note he was referring to neutral shipping, not British vessels like Lusitania, and that embroiling likely meant diplomatic tension rather than war. Britain depended on American supplies. U.S. entry into war would redirect those supplies to America's own military. But the questions don't end there. Room 40's intelligence was extensive but poorly shared. The code-breaking unit knew U-20's departure time. They tracked her transmissions. They knew her patrol route would take her directly into Lusitania's path. They also knew by May 6th and 7th that U-20 had sunk ships in the waters Lusitania would traverse, but Room 40's activities were so secret they were unknown even to the trade division responsible for warning merchant vessels. Only the highest officers saw the intelligence. Compartmentalization prevented effective warnings. HMS Juno, an obsolete cruiser that some have claimed was meant to escort Lusitania, was recalled to Queenstown on the morning of May 7th because such vessels were highly vulnerable to submarine attack. Critics allege this left Lusitania defenseless. However, no documentation exists that Juno was ever assigned as escort. Captain Turner never mentioned expecting one, and Juno's maximum speed of 19.5 knots was actually slower than Lusitania's reduced cruising speed. The warnings sent to Turner were partly outdated. The May 7th morning message about a submarine 20 miles south of Koningberg referred to events of the previous day, but Turner believed it was current intelligence, leading him to adjust course northeast, thinking he was avoiding danger. Patrick Beasley, a World War II naval intelligence veteran who studied Room 40's files after their 1976 declassification, concluded, "I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hope that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war." Most academic historians reject this conclusion. They characterize the incident as mainly a combination of British mistakes and misfortune rather than deliberate conspiracy. The crucial distinction is between incompetence and conspiracy. The Admiralty was clearly negligent and preoccupied with the disastrous Dardanelles campaign. But engineering a successful torpedo attack, requiring a submarine to be within a few hundred yards on precise bearing, would have been essentially impossible to coordinate with 1915 technology. The Mersey inquiry of June and July 1915 was itself compromised. Witnesses were carefully selected. Only 13 of 289 crew depositions survive. Evidence was suppressed. Pressure was applied to witnesses to claim 2 torpedoes struck the ship, supporting the British narrative of German savagery. Lord Mersey reportedly told his children afterward, "The Lusitania case was a damned dirty business." He exonerated Turner despite Admiralty pressure, placing all blame on, quote, "those who plotted and with those who committed the crime." The final toll was devastating. 1,198 dead, including 128 Americans and 94 children. Only 4 infants survived out of 35 aboard. The children's mortality rate of 75.8% was far higher than adults. Alfred Vanderbilt was last seen fastening his life belt onto a woman holding a baby. He could not swim. His body was never recovered. Charles Frohman reportedly quoted Peter Pan as the ship went down, "Why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure in life." Elbert Hubbard linked arms with his wife Alice and walked into a cabin, closing the door behind them. Their bodies were never found. Captain Turner fought off attacking seagulls while clinging to debris for 3 hours before rescue. He was pulled from the water by the steamboat Bluebell. Crew reportedly spotted his gold braid glinting in the afternoon light. Rescue vessels included Irish fishing boats, the paddle steamer tug Flying Fish, and various coastal craft. Survivors were brought to Queenstown, now called Cove, where the town was overwhelmed. Quote, "Even the saved appeared lost as, like zombies, they meandered around the streets, many dressed in borrowed clothes." Cunard offered cash rewards to fishermen for body recovery. 3 improvised morgues were established. On May 10th, approximately 160 victims were buried in mass graves at Old Church Cemetery. 80 of them were never identified. U.S. Consul Wesley Frost compiled lists, telegraphed relatives, and arranged improvised embalming, which was not practiced locally. He later wrote, "That is what the Lusitania means to me. Corpses." The sinking ignited a propaganda war of unprecedented intensity. Germany defended the attack as legitimate warfare against a ship carrying contraband munitions in a declared war zone after published warnings. The German Crown Prince reportedly expressed great joy. German newspapers celebrated the sinking as a success of moral significance. British intelligence exploited a German medalist's satirical medal, criticizing Cunard for endangering passengers. Karl Goetz had mistakenly engraved 5 May 1915, 2 days before the actual sinking. Captain Reginald Hall of Naval Intelligence ordered between 250,000 and 300,000 reproductions with the erroneous date, sold in presentation boxes for 1 shilling each, implying the attack was premeditated. The British Remember the Lusitania campaign featured the coroner's jury verdict charging the officers of the submarine and the Emperor and government of Germany with, quote, the crime of willful and wholesale murder. American newspapers erupted. The New York Herald called it a deliberate, cold-blooded, premeditated outrage. The Nation described it as a deed for which a Hun would blush, a Turk be ashamed, and a Barbary pirate apologize. News of the sinking shocked the American public much as Pearl Harbor and September 11th would shock future generations. President Wilson addressed newly naturalized citizens in Philadelphia 3 days later, delivering the phrase that would haunt him, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight." He reportedly regretted the words immediately. Theodore Roosevelt denounced Wilson's milk and water policy, demanding military reprisal. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, a pacifist who wanted even-handed treatment of British and German violations, resigned on June 9th rather than sign Wilson's strongly worded second protest note. But America did not go to war, not yet. Germany temporarily suspended unrestricted submarine warfare after the sinking. The Sussex Pledge of May 1916 promised passenger ships would not be targeted. The diplomatic crisis eased. The connection came 2 years later. On January 31st, 1917, Germany announced resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, calculating they could defeat Britain before American intervention mattered. Wilson severed diplomatic relations on February 3rd. The Zimmermann telegram, revealing German plans to help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in exchange for alliance against the United States, was disclosed on February 24th. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, citing German submarine warfare that had cost American lives and property. The Lusitania was not the single cause, but it had solidified public opinion and established the pattern of grievances that made intervention inevitable. After a century of investigation, dive expeditions, and declassified documents, the established facts are clear. U-20 fired 1 torpedo. All German records, Schwieger's log, radio intercepts, crew testimony confirm this, despite British claims of 2. Lusitania carried significant war materials, more than governments admitted for decades. Live ammunition, shrapnel shells with propellant charges, and volatile aluminum powder were aboard. 2 explosions occurred. Survivor testimony is nearly universal on this point. British negligence contributed to the disaster. Intelligence was not shared effectively. Warnings were inadequate. Escort was not provided despite available resources. There is no evidence of deliberate conspiracy. Negligence and compartmentalized bureaucracy explain the failures without requiring a plot. What remains genuinely uncertain is what caused the second explosion. Coal dust, steam, boiler rupture, and munitions all have advocates among serious researchers. The ship lies on her starboard side at 300 feet, with the torpedo wound embedded in the seabed, inaccessible to direct examination. The 2021 discovery of intact boilers rules out some theories but confirms none. The Lusitania's legacy extends beyond the death toll. The attack marked what historians call the end of the more civilized warfare of the 19th century. It demonstrated that modern technology had made distinctions between combatants and civilians increasingly meaningless. It showed how propaganda could shape neutral opinion, and how democratic nations would fight not just for territory but for hearts and minds. The wreck lies protected under Irish law, gradually collapsing under the currents of the Irish Sea. Annual commemoration ceremonies continue each May in Cove. The Lusitania Peace Memorial in Casement Square features bronze sculptures of an angel of peace and two exhausted fishermen. In Old Church Cemetery, glass memorials mark the mass graves where 170 victims rest, 80 of them nameless. The dead of the Lusitania, the children who drowned in their mother's arms, the millionaires and the steerage passengers, the crew trapped in flooding compartments, paid the price for decisions made in Berlin, London, and aboard U-20. Their deaths changed the world. Understanding exactly how and why remains, a century later, an obligation to their memory.